If psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
A new paper reveals more intelligent people are quicker to learn and unlearn.
90% chance that there's some weird animal out there.
Yeah. Stern's been doing this forever. And far more extreme. From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. Hey, welcome everybody. If you're joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you. If you're coming back for more, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville, and we have a great show for you. Our trending topic today is the coddling of the American university. It's the decline of American higher education. We'll get into that in our second segment, but first, let's meet our Charlotte panel. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is here. Hello, Emma Kate.
Hi, Dave. Hello.
So do you have any story of being in college or grad school that really stands out where a professor was particularly weird or unfair, or where some students did weird stuff? Anything stand out from your college experience?
I do remember I was making a comment on a article I was reading, and I'm pretty sure it was two Jewish researchers. And I just simply commented on how I thought it was a cool thing that they were Jewish researchers. And I remember this one other grad student in a very judgmental way asking me, why is that relevant? And I remember just thinking to myself, well, why can't it be a positive thing too? And so it was just an interesting, awkward encounter.
Yep. Lots of those. Dr. Frank Gaskell's with us. Speaking of awkward encounters, Jonathan Haidt here, and he's our certified Asian, speaking of politically incorrect statements, who rounds out our panel. And Jonathan, do you have a university story that stands out?
I really don't, but I'm going to be honest. I don't think I paid attention to most of my undergrad or graduate time in the classroom. I usually was just doing independent reading, and I mean, white men dressed up as terrorists could have walked in and I probably wouldn't have observed or noticed.
But wasn't your university a place where you just go find a wife?
For some people.
Okay.
I did take a class, a college level course called Authentic Manhood.
Ew.
Where we got to box in the class.
Ooh.
And like it was all about celebrating masculinity.
That's awesome.
So I don't recall if they had homemaking class for the women folk, but that would be something I wouldn't be shocked if that college had at the time.
Frank
Right.
literally just said, ew, that's awesome, to all of those masculine statements.
With his masculine vocal fry.
Yeah.
Yep. The Authentic Manhood class really paid off for you, Jonathan.
Yeah, most
proud of you.
definitely.
Well, each week, Jonathan trolls the internet and he finds a great story of psychology in the news for our first segment that we call
Being Human.
Some 50 years since the original marshmallow test, in which most preschoolers gobbled up one treat immediately rather than wait several minutes to get two, today's youngsters may be able to delay gratification significantly longer to get that extra reward. This was the key finding in a new study published by the American Psychological Association. Now, the ability to delay gratification in early childhood has been associated with a range of positive outcomes in adolescence and beyond. These findings stand in stark contrast with the assumption by adults that today's children actually have less self-control than previous generations. So, Frank, as our resident expert in less self-control, what do you make of this finding?
This research really slapped me in the face because it shows that we must continue to do research on things that we assume, because I assumed the research would say kids were worse at it, not better. I was fairly dumbfounded by this. But it, I think, makes sense because IQs increase, kids are more aware sooner, I think they develop faster. So it makes sense to me, honestly. I feel like kids are further along at that age now than they would have been 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I do like that now they're starting to consider socioeconomic status a little bit more too, where a lot of people would just assume, oh, well, the kids that are from a lower SES, they can't hold off because they're impulsive and that says something about them. But really, it's not impulsivity. It feels more about necessity, where if you live in a scarcity environment, you don't have enough resources like food, you need to eat while you have it. And then you're going to worry too, maybe someone's going to take that marshmallow.
In several episodes ago, we were talking about the Mr. Rogers documentary. And so if you think how much advancement there has been in early childhood development. And so very early on, I just remember most of my childhood being ignored and neglected. And quite honestly, I didn't mind. But nowadays, I'd probably be charged with childhood endangerment. And I just feel like very early on, really playing a central role in your children's lives that I think we're seeing that pay off with maybe that impulse control at a very young age.
One thing I want to comment on about the original research, because I think this has been distorted in some of the responses to this newer research. The original research was really good. There were some methodological issues like with socioeconomic status and things like that, but it was a well done study and it lasted for years and they really did collect good data. It wasn't made up. And so some of the press on this newer research says that was incorrect. I doubt it. I think that it was correct. And I think what we're finding is that there has been a change in kids over time, which again might be counterintuitive. We might have thought the change was going to go, with kids with social media and video gaming and internet, that their ability to delay gratification was going to decline, but it seems like it's actually increased. And that's exactly why we need updated research and good research that's not based on assumptions that they're trying to prove only, but also really letting the research say what it's going to say.
And both as a parent and as a mental health professional, I always need that perspective because most of my day is spent with young guys and their families that have some identified struggles or problems in life. So it'd be really easy just in my profession to get this very narrow slice of how young people are handling everyday life and then skew my perception of all of today's youth from that. Because every parent I meet in therapy, they think their kids have no impulse control. They think they are so out of control, but they're basing that on their own kids' behavior versus the overall kind of consensus.
And that's the danger that we have in our profession. The vantage point that we're looking at things through are people that come in for therapy who've got identified problems in that area. And so it'd be easy for us to be sitting here going, the kids these days, they have worse impulse control and they don't delay gratification. And that, in fact, might not be true. If you've got questions or comments about this idea of the marshmallow study updated, we'd love for you to write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. We'd love to hear from you. Our next segment is about a book that is coming out called The Coddling of the American Mind. It's by a great researcher, lecturer, professor named Jonathan Haidt, and it's Haidt. He wrote one of my favorite books ever, and I've recommended it on the podcast. I'm going to recommend it again. It's called The Righteous Mind, and he talks about how people make moral judgments and how people with different kinds of minds and different kinds of cultural backgrounds make moral judgments. And I say, just like we said last week, that 8th grade is required reading for all 8th graders and parents of 8th graders, this is, I think, the Righteous Mind is required reading or listening for anybody that is a citizen. I mean that honestly.
Wow.
It's something that as a citizen in our culture, in our country today, we need to read. But his newest book, which we'll acknowledge we haven't read yet, is called The Coddling of the American Mind. And he really says that the American university, and again, I'm paraphrasing without having read the book directly, that there are 3 assumptions or 3 things that have emerged that are really choking the university as we know it. And those assumptions are, number 1, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Number 2, always trust your feelings. And number 3, life is a battle between good people and bad people. That those ideas have gotten out there and they're being taught or inferred. And because of that, it's really closing down the American University. I think I called it The Coddling of the American Mind. I think it's The Coddling of the American University is the title of the book. But let me ask you guys if you have, no, it actually is The Coddling of the American Mind. Sorry, that is the title. So let me ask you guys if you have agreement with this idea that something's going on in the American University that's not necessarily good. And before you say that, I'll also say we've gotten some feedback that our show skews pretty liberal. And the truth is that we've got people on this panel, myself included, that wouldn't necessarily consider themselves liberal per se, maybe moderate. But we have gone after a lot of conservative ideas and targets. But this is definitely, we're going after some of what we think might be some liberalism gone haywire. Emma Kate, what's your thought about this?
So when we're kind of preparing for this particular talk, I was thinking about my own college experience, and I realized I went to College of Charleston for undergrad, which, that's in South Carolina, which is not historically very liberal, but Charleston in and of itself does have more liberal ideas. And I never felt as though free speech was limited in any way or anything of that nature, but I guess I do think there has been a weird shift where college doesn't quite, universities and the idea of appropriate debate between ideas, that sort of intellectual conversation, it's not the same.
Frank, your opinion?
I feel like, because I would agree with what you said, this kind of black and white, you're either good or bad, and I feel the need to call you out on things. And it feels as if you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's, well, if you believe this, then you're a horrible person. And that we're losing the ability to laugh at ourselves. We're taking ourselves too seriously. And I think universities are creating an atmosphere for that with safe zones and all that other stuff that prevents kids from being exposed to difficult situations or difficult emotional conversations and not knowing how to do that or engage in that effectively.
Yeah, and I think overall, we as a culture are losing, or we're going backwards when it comes to critical thinking and having nuanced conversation and open dialogue. And I think it's permeated the university campus as well. We see this in our news. We see this in communication with one another. The ability to tolerate and engage with others that have different opinions, values, and beliefs. And we've become a culture of hyperbole and black or white, all or nothing extremism. Like it blows my mind when you hear these headlines of a controversial speaker coming to a university campus, and there's these protests, like even having them speak on campus somehow suggests that you're validating or supporting their beliefs. And I just find that so laughably absurd, and yet there just seems to be a portion of our culture and society that believes that and sees the world through those lenses. I can't fathom it.
And I'll be Professor Dave here for a little bit, but my understanding of how the university formed originally in France, in Paris, was Peter Abelard formed this notion that people would come together and do what he would call disputations, to dispute. And you would have a position and I would have a position that was diametrically opposed, and you would bring your evidence and your ideas, and the other person would bring their evidence and ideas, and they would clash, and out of that, truth would emerge. And that was the foundation of the university.
Did you guys have a lot of good arguments, Dave?
Oh, yeah. Peter and I, we would just hang out all the time.
Did you have a sleepover at his house?
When I was in 8th grade, yeah.
Yeah.
But so that's sort of the foundation, and the American University was based on that, and historically has been about that. It's been about competing ideas that sharpen each other, and truth emerges. And one of the things that's most distressing is that many, and I don't know if we can say most, we don't know most university campuses, but certainly our experience supports the idea that many university campuses do not allow divergent points of view. And the bad thing about that is that it takes away one of the benefits of higher education, which is divergent thinking, critical thinking, being able to be exposed to a range of ideas, many of which you might find disagreeable or even offensive. And out of that, you learn and grow and become a person who can think better.
Yeah. One of the things, and this may be an exaggeration or a stereotype, but historically in American universities is when they really pushed back kind of religious thought or conservatism. In the extreme nature, you saw conservative populations pull away from universities. And so then you have this fear of education, and you have this automatic suspicion of the scientific method or data and things along those lines. And then on the other side, you have liberal populations that become these intellectual elitists, and they talk down to people. Like, both are very problematic in our culture and society.
Yeah, and it doesn't take us to a good place, and I think we're reaping the results of that now. I think our culture, in terms of how we think and how we respond in the social square, the public square, reflects that we have people that have information, but they don't know how to think well about divergent points of view and things that oppose their way of seeing things. What do you think about this notion that Haidt proposes, that one of the things that's choking the American mind is the idea of what doesn't kill you makes you weaker? Like, rather than, if you face something hard, it strengthens you and you become more resilient, that the university promotes this idea that we must keep people away from tough things, tough ideas, tough experiences, because if they're exposed to it, it will harm you. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I feel like we've talked about this in a previous podcast not too long ago when we hit on resilience, where we made this point about resilience being fostered by actually facing adversity, where, for example, if you've experienced trauma, you don't just avoid it, you actually face it. And so, I think on college campuses now, we all fall into this notion of groupthink, where we don't form our own ideas and opinions at times because we don't want to upset or offend. And that's kind of dangerous territory. And this point that he's bringing up is really true. And that's how we're getting into this kind of black and white polarization, where there's a term called outgroup homogeneity, where essentially we view anyone that's not within our group to be the same. And yet anyone that's within our group, we're varied and different. And so, you can see this kind of coin with the liberal versus conservative. Oh, you're a Trump supporter. Or, oh, if you're conservative, you must be a Trump supporter. And so it really creates this nasty dichotomy that's not healthy.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much of this is just seeping into. One of my questions is, how much has social media affected all of this, and how this generation of protective parents has swung so far that kids are modeling that these professors are not necessarily the professors I had in the 80s. And so there's this generation of protectiveness people coming up, but you have all this emotion around social media and this quick sharing and concern about appearances that is just magnified through the university setting. And it's almost trying to create conformity in these tribes of people.
And that may be the case. I don't know where I fall into that kind of outlook, but I feel like this is happening earlier just in our education system at large. I remember growing up, and a large portion of my education was about critical thinking. I remember actually having debate. It wasn't a debate club. It was practicing the art of debate and formulating a sound argument and a rebuttal. And just, over the years, watching my own kids go through the educational system, so much of their education is about the absorption of information and then the regurgitation of information, to the point where, like, writing a lot of research papers, being able to formulate a train of thought, I think we are losing. And I think that we're bringing young people into the university experience that this idea of critical thinking and debate, they really haven't been exposed to it in their education.
Yeah. And again, like you were kind of saying, education is meant to make you think and form independent judgments. And so we are losing that. And the community as a whole for education, I don't think there's anything wrong with criticizing a teaching method. And so if something is offensive within how you're trying to get across a point, that's okay. But it's just how we're having these conversations that's problematic, where we immediately jump to going at each other's throats over something versus having a true dialogue about it.
When I was growing up, I would have, I'd have maybe 10 people that I would debate ideas with, and I'd probably encounter some of my parents' friends, and I would hear discussions. And other than that, I'm sitting around watching 3 channels on TV and PBS. So I wasn't exposed to all of this stuff on Earth, number one, but I did not have the option to say, I am now going to only surround people with the stuff I sort of believe in. That wasn't a possibility.
Yeah, it was a different era where you were going to take what information came your way, and you couldn't select it down to be only what you wanted to hear or what agreed with you.
Right.
Well, this is a hard question, and I don't know if we'll have a ready answer for it, but it sounds like we're in agreement that there's something going on culturally that's affecting higher education and, as Haidt would say, the coddling of the American mind. Is there anything to be done about it? If so, what? Any ideas?
Oh, that's a really hard question.
Well, I will say one thing that's been really positive, and I should have looked into it a little bit more before today. The University of Chicago actually came out kind of with this freedom of speech statement for their students, where a lot of times you see students reaching out to administration about something that's offensive or something that's bothering them, and they have just kind of taken this stance that nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to appeal to the emotions of the students, with the understanding that you come to the university to be exposed to things that might challenge you and that might make you uncomfortable, and that's okay. And so I would say that is a great starting point to kind of be a catalyst, where I would wish other universities to take on something like that sort of stance.
Well, and we started this episode talking about the marshmallow test and just how socioeconomic factors maybe play into some of that research. As much as I hate to admit it, our capitalist and consumer society, money oftentimes moves the machinery. And so you see even businesses and companies now lamenting a workforce that doesn't have the critical thinking skills and the undervaluing of a liberal arts education, where college has become so much about getting a specialty and getting a job versus higher education. You see high school where the focus is about getting into college rather than the education and development of the critical thinking mind. I really believe businesses and our consumer society really has the power to change how each of those levels of education is orchestrated and designed.
And I think I listened to a TED Talk, maybe 2 days ago. I can't remember the name of the person, but she argues that our society has increasingly said, okay, you're going to go to college. What do you want to do? Okay, know as much as you can about that thing. And then once you know that thing, I want you to know even more about a special part of that thing. And that as a society, we are now learning less and less about anything. And we can't have this broad understanding of other facts and to be able to think about it.
Well, there's more to talk about, and we'll resume it later after we get a chance to actually read this book, but I'm going to recommend it. That shifts us into our final segment that we call our doctor's orders. These are things that we're personally recommending in pop culture. I'll go first and say I'm going to recommend The Coddling of the American Mind. It's the first time on the podcast I've recommended something that I actually haven't read or seen, but it's by Greg, I hope I get his name right, Lukianoff, and Jonathan Haidt, who I've referred to in this podcast and earlier. And I'm just going to take a chance and say, based on his earlier work, it's going to be a ringer. So I'm going to recommend that. Emma Kate, what do you have?
So I enjoy watching just kind of random things on Netflix from time to time. And I stumbled upon, this is an older series, but it's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee by Jerry Seinfeld. And I actually really enjoyed it, where Seinfeld picks comedians up in these classic cars and basically does a mini talk show with him. And it's, he had an episode with Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, and I actually really liked it.
Frank.
Yeah, I would, in line with Emma Kate's recommendation, I would like to recommend Electricity and Light Bulbs.
And I Love Lucy.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Okay, so I have two recommendations. Number one is on the Shrink Tank webpage or the Shrink Tank site or on our Twitter feed, look for the most difficult Rick and Morty quiz you could possibly ever take. It is so hard, it's just ridiculous. But take it. Second thing is I want to recommend you go out immediately and buy the Hogwarts Lego Castle that was released on August 15th. It is amazing.
How much does it cost?
It's a lot.
It's a lot of money, and it's worth every penny, right, Emma Kate?
Right, and this is the one time I won't make fun of Frank for liking toys.
Thank you. It's not a toy.
Or having the money to buy expensive toys.
Oh, my gosh. It's a tax write-off.
A tax write-off. Jonathan.
One of our summer interns named Phoebe Davis, who is back at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, did a presentation on Orange Theory, a exercise program, high intensity. And for fun, I went with Phoebe and another employee here to try it out. And I love it. I'm very surprised, but I've been doing workouts about 3 times a week at Orange Theory. And there's just something about having accountability or getting out of your house to do something that I struggle with, like putting that extra effort in with weights or a treadmill at home. So I never thought I would say this, but I'm recommending a high-intensity workout program called Orange Theory.
And that will do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. You can check us out on shrinktank.com for great articles and videos, and also find our links to Doctor's Orders products right there on shrinktank.com. Follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank, and please like us on Facebook. If you have questions or comments about the podcast, drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. And if you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. That helps us build our audience, and we would greatly appreciate it. We love you long time. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck, and our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Haidt, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.